The hostel always grew quieter after midnight, as if the walls themselves agreed to keep secrets. Ethan Miller lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling where the tube light flickered and then surrendered to darkness. Around him, the room breathed softly, someone turning in their sleep, a distant cough from the corridor, the hum of an old ceiling fan struggling against the heat. Nights like this usually passed without meaning, but that evening carried a restlessness Ethan could not name. Ethan had been living in the hostel for nearly a year, long enough for the place to feel permanent and temporary at the same time. He followed routines carefully, classes during the day, quiet dinners, late night scrolling on his phone while messages from his long-distance girlfriend, Mark Reynolds, appeared and disappeared without warmth. Mark used to ask questions, used to listen. Lately, their conversations felt rehearsed, stripped of urgency, like something both of them were maintaining out of habit rather than desire. Ethan told himself that was normal. He told himself many things. Ryan Parker, his closest friend in the hostel, occupied the bed across from him. Ryan slept easily, confidence following him even into dreams. He had a laugh that filled rooms and a way of talking to people that made them feel chosen. Ethan admired that about him, trusted him. Ryan was the one constant in a place where faces changed every semester. Earlier that evening, Ryan had mentioned his brother was coming to stay for a night or two. Lucas is in town for work, Ryan had said casually, tossing his bag onto the bed. He didn't want a hotel. Ethan had nodded, unbothered. Visitors were common. Brothers, cousins, friends passing through, the hostel absorbed them all and forgot them just as easily. But when Lucas Parker arrived, the room seemed to shift as he entered quietly, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, eyes adjusting to the dim light. Lucas was older than Ryan, maybe by 5 or 6 years, and carried himself differently. Where Ryan moved with ease, Lucas moved with intention. He shook Ethan's hand, his grip firm but not dominating, and introduced himself with a small, polite smile. "Lucas," he said. "Ryan's talked about you." Ethan wasn't sure why that sentence stayed with him. He only managed a brief response before Ryan began filling the silence with jokes and stories, bridging the gap like he always did. Lucas listened more than he spoke, his attention steady, his expressions controlled. When their eyes met again later, it was brief, almost accidental, yet it lingered longer than necessary. The lights went out soon after. A power cut, common, inconvenient, and usually forgettable. Phones lit up the room in fragments, pale screens casting shifting shadows across the walls. Someone cursed softly from the far corner. Ryan laughed it off and rolled over, already half asleep again. Ethan sat up, intending to fetch water from the corridor. As he slid off the bed, he noticed Lucas sitting upright, his face illuminated faintly by the glow of his phone. "Power cuts always feel longer at night," Lucas said quietly, as if loud voices might break the fragile calm. Ethan nodded. "You get used to them here." Lucas smiled at that, then put his phone away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, but it wasn't empty either. It felt charged, like a question waiting for the right words. Ethan realized, with mild surprise, that he felt seen. Not examined, not judged, just noticed. It unsettled him more than he expected. He returned to his bed, but sleep didn't come. His thoughts drifted, uninvited, toward the brief exchange, the tone of Lucas's voice, the steadiness in his eyes. Ethan told himself it was nothing. A stranger's presence, a break in routine. Still, his chest felt tight, as though something inside him had shifted slightly out of place. The next morning arrived slowly. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, revealing the room in honest detail: scuffed floors, mismatched beds, bags stuffed into corners. Ryan was already awake, teasing Lucas about his snoring. Lucas responded with dry humor, rolling his eyes in a way that made Ryan laugh harder. Ethan watched them, noting the ease between brothers. He felt like an observer rather than a participant, a role he had grown comfortable with over time. When Lucas caught him looking, Ethan looked away too quickly, heat rising to his face for no clear reason. They shared breakfast in a common area, a cramped space filled with chipped tables and the smell of instant coffee. Conversation flowed easily, mostly driven by Ryan. Lucas asked Ethan about his studies, listened carefully to the answers, and followed up with questions that showed genuine interest. It wasn't flirtation. It was attention, pure and simple. And it felt dangerous. Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. A message from Mark. Miss you. Busy today. Ethan stared at the screen longer than necessary, then typed a short reply and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Lucas noticed the movement but said nothing. By afternoon, Ryan left for class, leaving Ethan and Lucas alone in the room. The silence returned, different now, less accidental, more deliberate. Lucas sat on Ryan's bed, flipping through a notebook. Ethan pretended to read, though the words blurred together. You seem like someone who thinks a lot, Lucas said eventually. Ethan looked up, surprised. Do I? Lucas nodded. It shows. In the pauses. Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He only knew that the comment felt intimate in a way that unsettled him. He closed his book, exhaled slowly, and offered a small smile. Maybe. Nothing more was said, but the air between them held a new weight. Ethan felt the edge of a line he hadn't known existed, a boundary drawn not by rules but by awareness. He didn't cross it. Not yet. Still, as the afternoon light faded and the hostel prepared for another quiet night, Ethan understood something with startling clarity. That moment, small, silent, almost invisible, had already changed the shape of things. And some changes, once begun, refused to be undone. Lucas Parker stayed longer than planned. What began as a single night stretched quietly into days, explained away by delayed meetings and convenient excuses that Ryan accepted without suspicion. The hostel absorbed Lucas into its rhythm, and with each passing hour, Ethan felt his own sense of balance shift. Mornings became shared routines. Ethan would wake early, pretending it was habit rather than anticipation, and find Lucas already awake, sitting near the window with a cup of weak hostel coffee. They spoke in low voices, about ordinary things at first, classes, work, the inconvenience of city traffic, but the conversations carried an ease that felt earned rather than forced. Lucas listened with a patience Ethan wasn't used to. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to respond. He allowed silence to exist, and in those pauses, Ethan found himself speaking more honestly than he intended. Ryan noticed nothing unusual. He moved through the days with the same openness, the same trust. When he joked about the three of them becoming temporary roommates, Ethan laughed along, even as something tightened inside his chest. The ease with which Ryan included them both only sharpened Ethan's growing unease. By the third night, Ethan began to recognize the pattern of his own thoughts. He waited for Lucas's footsteps in the corridor. He noticed the way Lucas's voice softened when he spoke to him directly. These were small things, insignificant on their own, yet together they formed something that demanded attention. Ethan told himself it was admiration, nothing more. Lucas was older, composed, everything Ethan felt he was not. It made sense to be drawn to that. Still, guilt crept in quietly. It arrived when Ethan checked his phone and saw Mark's name lighting up the screen. Their conversations had grown thinner, filled with updates instead of emotions. Mark talked about work, about being tired, about plans that never included Ethan beyond vague promises. Ethan responded politely, affectionately, while feeling increasingly detached. He hated himself for noticing the difference between obligation and desire. One evening, the hostel corridor echoed with laughter and distant music. Ethan sat on his bed, pretending to study, when Lucas spoke from across the room. "You don't seem fully here tonight." Ethan looked up. "I'm just tired." Lucas considered him for a moment. "You say that like it explains everything." The comment wasn't accusatory. It was careful, almost gentle. Ethan felt something loosen inside him, a thread pulled free. He closed his book. "Some things are harder to explain." Lucas nodded, as if he understood more than Ethan had said. "They usually are." After that, the distance between them narrowed. Not physically, but emotionally. They shared late-night conversations when Ryan was asleep or out with friends, their voices kept deliberately low. Lucas spoke about his work, the pressure of responsibility, the loneliness that came with always being the dependable one. Ethan listened, surprised by how much he wanted to understand this man beyond surface impressions. That in return, Ethan spoke about feeling invisible in his own life, about choosing silence because it felt safer than honesty. He didn't mention Mark by name at first, but Lucas understood. Some truths announce themselves without introduction. You don't have to disappear to keep the peace, Lucas said once, his voice steady in the dim room. Ethan looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt the weight of the words settle deep. No one had ever said that to him before. The realization scared him that he began to measure his days differently. Moments with Lucas felt charged, meaningful, while everything else faded into background noise. He caught himself smiling at nothing, replaying conversations in his head. The awareness of what this meant arrived slowly, like dawn breaking against closed eyes. This wasn't harmless. It wasn't neutral. One afternoon, Ryan left early for class, leaving Ethan and Lucas alone again. The room was quiet, sunlight slanting across the floor. Lucas stood near the window, watching the campus below. You seem conflicted, Lucas said without turning around. Ethan swallowed. I am. Lucas faced him then, expression serious. About what? Ethan hesitated. The easy answer was exhaustion, stress, anything that would keep the truth buried. Instead, he chose honesty, though it frightened him. About how close this feels. Lucas didn't move closer. He didn't step away either. Does it feel wrong to you? Yes, Ethan said quickly. Then, after a pause, and no. The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate. Lucas exhaled slowly. I don't want to be a problem in your life. You're not, Ethan replied, too quickly. He corrected himself. I mean, you matter. That's the problem. Lucas studied him, eyes searching, careful. You have someone. Ethan nodded. Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't felt before. Yes. Lucas's jaw tightened slightly, a brief fracture in his composure. Then we need to be honest about what this is. Ethan felt the truth settle into place with uncomfortable clarity. He hadn't crossed a physical line, but something else had already been breached. His loyalty had thinned, stretched between what was expected and what was felt. I don't know how to stop thinking about this, Ethan admitted. Lucas looked away, back toward the window. Neither do I. That admission changed everything. It wasn't a confession of love, but it was acknowledgement, and it carried consequences. From that moment on, every shared glance felt deliberate, every conversation edged with restraint. That night, Ethan lay awake again, the hostile quiet around him. Mark's unanswered message sat on his phone. Lucas's presence lingered in the room, unmistakable even in silence. Ethan understood, with a mix of fear and clarity, that he was standing on the wrong side of a line he could no longer pretend not to see, and knowing that didn't make stepping back any easier. The hostel returned to its familiar quiet on Lucas Parker's last night, the kind of silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Ethan Miller recognized it immediately. It was the same hush that had framed their first real conversation, now heavier with everything left unsaid. Ryan Parker had gone out with friends, leaving the room to the two of them and the truth neither had managed to escape. Lucas folded his clothes with care, as if precision could keep emotion at a distance. Ethan sat on his bed, hands clasped together, watching the slow dismantling of a presence that had reshaped his days. Each item placed into the duffel bag felt final, a reminder that time did not pause for unresolved feelings. You've been quiet, Lucas said without looking up. Ethan inhaled slowly. I'm trying to say the right thing. Lucas closed the bag and finally met his gaze. There isn't always a right thing. Sometimes there's only honesty. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of that truth. I didn't expect this, he said. Any of it. Neither did I, Lucas replied. His voice was steady, but something vulnerable flickered beneath it. That doesn't make it harmless. The acknowledgement settled between them, solid and unavoidable. Ethan felt the urge to minimize what had happened, to frame it as a passing attachment, but he couldn't. It had altered him too deeply for that. He had crossed an unseen threshold, one marked not by action but by intention. "I care about you," Ethan said quietly. Saying it felt dangerous and necessary all at once. "And that scares me." Lucas's expression softened, though he didn't move closer. "It scares me too. That's why I'm glad I'm leaving." The words stung, though Ethan understood them. Lucas wasn't rejecting him, he was protecting something: Ryan, boundaries, perhaps even Ethan himself. That realization carried a strange comfort and an equally sharp ache. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Ethan said. "I know," Lucas replied. "But meaning isn't the same as impact." They stood there, the space between them charged with restraint. The hostel creaked around them, as if reminding them that life beyond the room continued regardless of their hesitation. Ethan's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He didn't need to check it to know it was Mark Reynolds. The familiar pull of obligation surfaced, but this time it didn't overpower the truth. He had already drifted away emotionally. Ignoring that fact wouldn't make it disappear. "I need to face what I've been avoiding," Ethan said, more to himself than to Lucas. Lucas nodded. "That's the hardest part." They talked then, not about what could have been, but about what was. Lucas spoke of leaving with clarity rather than regret. Ethan listened, absorbing the quiet integrity in Lucas's choice. It made the loss sharper, but it also gave it meaning. When Ryan returned later that night, laughing and loud, the moment dissolved. Lucas greeted him easily, the warmth between brothers intact. Ethan watched them, struck by how ordinary everything looked from the outside. That normalcy felt like both a relief and a burden. The next morning came too quickly. The three of them walked toward the hostel entrance, sunlight cutting through the early haze. Ryan talked about future visits, about staying in touch. Lucas agreed, his tone sincere. When it was time to say goodbye, he hugged Ryan first, then turned to Ethan. The hug was brief, appropriate, but it carried everything they hadn't allowed themselves to express. Lucas leaned in just enough to speak softly. "Be honest," he said. "With yourself most of all." Ethan nodded, unable to trust his voice. Lucas left, disappearing into the crowd beyond the gate. The absence was immediate, like a sound abruptly cut off. Ryan stretched and smiled, already moving on to the day ahead. Ethan followed him back inside, the hostel resuming its ordinary rhythm, but something had shifted permanently. Later, alone in the room, Ethan sat on his bed and finally opened Mark's message. He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing. The words came slowly, deliberately, shaped by the clarity he could no longer deny. Whatever happened next would be difficult, but it would be real. As evening settled in, the familiar silence returned, no longer unsettling but reflective. Ethan understood now that the moment which had changed everything wasn't defined by secrecy or longing alone. It was defined by awareness, the realization that avoiding truth was its own form of betrayal. He lay back and closed his eyes, knowing this chapter had ended, even as its consequences stretched ahead. The story wasn't finished. It had only reached the point where pretending was no longer an option.